Thanks so much, Lori, for having me talk about Savannah today, a passion of mine for, 15, 20 years almost, and a lot of work in Savannah restoration and thinking and research and so on and so forth. And so I want to share with you a accumulation of all that, those experiences I've had research. Currently, I work with Stantec. We're a design and consulting firm. We're international in our scope, and um, our company has taken on ecosystem restoration as a very important initiative in the decade of restoration, according to the United Nations and Society of Ecological Restoration. So I am here from Stantec today, and I'm happy to be part of this presentation. Okay, so first of all, I think, again, we should all be thankful for Lori, Pollinator Friendly Alliance, for the work that they do, the work that they've done, and this summit putting it together. I've always the most fun and enjoyable summits to attend and participate in, just for their resource. All right, so the overview of this presentation, I'm gonna provide a unique Savannah ecology. And I want to get you to think about savannas differently than maybe we currently think about, and also ecosystem ecology differently, and what restoration might be in the future. We're going to look at Savanna evolution, how it came to be, its geography on the planet, the power of savanna. And yesterday we heard Heather and Sarah talk about the powerhouse species, and I love that term. And so I already had this savanna power written up there, and we'll talk about that. We'll look at how savannas have declined via like a catastrophic regime shift, what that restoration looks like, and how that restoration might impact our future societies. Okay. By doing so, we're going to look at some keystone species. We're going to look at disturbance, non-equilibrium succession, maximum power law, and ecosystem phenomenology, terms that you can become more familiar. We're going to look at some definitions too, like what do we mean by forest? What do we mean by savanna? And at the end of this presentation, I think you'll have at least some ideas that you then can think about. Again, I've been an instructor for lots of points in my life in various different roles of being an instructor. And I've never, ever, I've always told my students explicitly, I'm not going to tell you what to think. I'm going to try to teach you how to think. And I think we don't do that in our educational institutions anymore, and a variety of reasons. But anyways, I just want to inspire you to think about what you see today. I'm not going to tell you what to think. Okay. But and some of the current social myths that we're going to talk about too are oak forests, oak woodlands. Are they valid plant communities? Is a tree landscape just because there's trees on it? Does that mean it's a forest? Are prairie and savanna really different from one another? Is savanna merely a transition between grassland and forest, like we assume? Does savanna really just cover 3, 5, or 10%? Are invasive species invasive, or has the landscape become invasible? So just some things to think about as we move forward with this. But here's my thesis. And one reason that savanna is so important to me, the whole concept. And so this is the concept. Earth's savannas, no matter where we are on Earth, and we'll talk about the geography in a bit, represent the most evolutionary advance, and that's based on paleoecology and fossil records. The most functional, and that's based on the capacity of the ecosystem to capture and degrade solar energy through food webs. The most productive of quality structures, and that's energy, just production in itself, like a patch of reed canary grass, or a whole stand of cattails. We just weigh the biomass in it, we're talking quality in that structure. The amount of energy that we as a food web, as a biosphere, can get out of that biomass. So that's what the whole concept of energy, that's an Odom concept, measures quality. And the savanna is also the most provisional of all terrestrial ecosystems ever, providing us with the most healthy soil, best water purification, most edible structures, the greatest degree of biodiversity, nutrient regulation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's what savanna is, okay? So just to put it in a sentence form, Earth savannas represent the most evolutionary advanced, functional, productive, and provisional terrestrial ecosystem ever. And for Heather and Sarah, the most powerful terrestrial ecosystem also. So likewise, and here's another part of this thesis, which may be a little bit different when we're thinking about of savanna. Prior to Industrial Revolution, when we were able to really harness the Earth, it was the dominant Earth ecosystem. Because it was so evolutionary advanced, it had taken over. And so I hope right away you're starting to think about different things. Here's an oak forest in Europe. Very different from what we consider an oak forest right here. So anyways, I love that painting. Rain in the oak forest. Okay, so why does this matter? That's another really important part of this whole conversation. Due to the savanna capacity, and I use that in a thermodynamic, like a capacitor in machine. Savanna's capacity to provision abundant ecosystem services on real-time solar energy, not fossil energy, but real-time solar energy, solar, wind, etc., in ways that maximize biosphere integrity, a functional earth, a healthy earth, including soil, water purification, climate regulation, et cetera, et cetera. Savanna offers humanity the ultimate model for sustainable real-time solar energy planet. So as we build our transportation systems, our school systems, our food systems, Savanna's the model. And it's a 30, 40 million year evolved model that Savanna provides us. So again, working for an engineering design consulting firm, international level, these are the models that we use. Our current solar panels on the ground. I'm going to tell you, the oak tree is probably the ultimate solar capture machine that we know of. So why aren't our solar panels up in the air and spread out in these Fibonacci patterns to capture the solar energy? So that's kind of what I'm talking about with that. Okay. So anyways, pollinators obviously play a keystone role in savanna ecosystem because of all that power there and all the powerhouses inside of it. And while we need to understand the parts of those machines, natural history, we just don't teach anymore. And that's what the study of parts are. It's so amazing. But we also need to take that natural history and those parts and bring it up to fit them into an ecosystem, how those parts fit together to produce a functional engine or machine. Somebody once told me that grazing is a tool in the toolbox. I'm like, no, it's not. I think grazing is a part of the machine. The tool is a wrench or a fence, So anyways, it's just metaphors, I guess. I'm going to use two of the greatest ecologists ever to live. E.P. Odom. These guys are brothers, Howard Odom. Fantastic. So I'm going to use a lot of their concepts. I love this stuff, man. So anyways, these are just two gentlemen. They wrote the very first ecology textbook. I think they're inspired by Raymond Linderman of the University of Minnesota and the Cedar Creek work. What was it called? The Trophic Dynamic, a great paper that came out. So anyways, before he died. And some of my favorite Odom reads. So you can have this. Just, I love these guys. A 1953 textbook up in the upper right-hand corner. I had one. I got it from Paul's bookstore in Madison, and I gave it to my buddy in his wedding, and I see they're worth like $900 now. There you go. And 207 down there, Environment, Power, and Society in the lower left-hand side. I've met people that said that whole book is transformed. That's kind of a pun. Has transformed the way they think about ecology. So two things to think about. And this is kind of some of the Odom's models right here that I have used for years to help me think about doing ecosystem ecology and what do I want to restore. On the very far left-hand side, these ecosystem attributes, that's what an ecosystem is made out of, these components, these functional things that we can measure. This functional system, buckthorn infested oak woodland, is kind of the orange salmon colored, and finally on the right-hand side, that's what we want to restore. And so this is the framework. The Odoms provide us the framework. Oh yeah, we want to restore the far left. We want to restore these functional ecosystems. Thankfully, native species are already there. They already do all these things. Obviously, it's a highly evolved system over time. And that's what we've gotten. I'm also going to throw in concepts of Holling. C.S. Holling, another hero of mine, from the 50s all the way until just recently. He just passed away a couple of years ago. When I told my lab back in Madison, I said, oh my God, C.S. Holling died. I was told by my advisor, it's like C.S. Holling was probably the greatest ecologist that ever lived. But if you read Holling, when he introduced the Odoms, he always says, and the Howard Odom, or and the Eugene Odom. So pretty incredible group of people right here. All right, into the savanna, here we go. So let's look at the evolution of savanna, how it got here. And down, there's a timeline kind of that in the lower part. 400 million years ago, the very first plants came out on the planet, and they were the mosses and liverworts, and it was the age of fishes. And about 100 million years later, we get our coal. That's where we're getting the sunlight energy when we burn coal, okay? It's like 400, 300 million year buried. You ever wonder why the Earth buried that stuff? I mean, it's a waste product, right? It's entropy, so get rid of it, and we're digging it up and burning it again. So, Anyways, that was the age of kind of insects, amphibians, reptiles, and these giant coal forests that just fell in the swamp. Nothing's edible. There's no herbivores in this case. The first herbivores show up with the dinosaurs, and that occurred about 150 million years ago. And then when the meteorite hit the planet, it released the age of flowers and mammals. And when I say flowers, I mean basically grasslands. So again, just a quick review. 300 million years ago, 150 million years ago, here came that meteorite. And all mass extinctions, we lament the loss of these species, but they also are a filter. And what they let through are these organisms that always increase their endothermic homeostatic regulation of temperature and nutrients, and they provide food for their offspring. So the initial conditions of every mass extinction afterwards sets up for more advanced biodiversity. The problem with these, they take about 20 million years to reorganize. So we don't want to go through a mass extinction in our lifetime. 20 million years. So this is the onset of the savanna. The mammals and the grasslands start to come on. There's a very famous German artist that actually drew this back in the late 1800s. I just found that out recently. And then by 35 million years ago, really the grasslands had come to dominate the planet. And a lot of the plants that we are used to today are evolved at about 30 million years ago. A lot of these plants are here, at least their origins were here to go forward. The paintings and drawings here are all dioramas in museums. These artists, they study all the fossils, plants, and animals, and they try to put together what it would look like. Really cool. It's an interpretation. It's their data interpretation. Sometimes we fail to understand that. Art's a powerful tool. Anyways, again, very close by. This is the Minnesota River Valley 10,000 years ago. Hard to get pictures like that these days. We had a lot of herbivores, a lot of grassland, very savanna looking. If you look in that, Minnesota actually had 3 species of elephants living in it when people were here hunting them. It wasn't that long ago. Over in Russia, they actually eat mammoth meat still. It's against the law because it's a national treasure. So you're not supposed to eat it, but they still do. We had 4 species of buffalo here. The largest is twice the size of our current. I found a toothed one once up in Ely, Minnesota. Bison giganticus, 4,000-pound species. What's really interesting, we talk about climate change. The paper down below here, Talak, great paper about literally the feedbacks between savanna ecosystems of the planet and grazing animals lowered the CO2 levels so low that the ice ages appeared, which were good for warm-blooded, endothermic, warm-blooded mammals. So they created, it's like Goldilocks. Oh, it was the climate. We were out there in space, just the perfect spot. Mammals and grasslands created their own chair to sit in, or their own bed to sleep in, or their own porch to eat. So it's a very powerful. That means our climate is a biotic emergence. So why would we want to destroy something that's beautiful like that? Minnesota River Valley, looking north towards the Metropolitan Airport Commission over there. Overkill by people. Literally, I was just reading a paper the other night that humans got better and better at killing these things. So the savanna began to disappear because the trees were allowed to grow instead of being harvested by these pachyderms in our area. And so the final stomach analysis of the latest and the last few of these pachyderms right now in Minnesota and Wisconsin, this area, are full of like pine needles, which is a very low quality food. They want to eat grasses and sedges. So again, we can see that the savannas, the grassland tree communities are obligate to that grooming by animals. So anyways, kind of to wrap up, we can see forest as the more primitive condition. The meteorite took it out about 65 million years ago. It's composed of maples, magnolias, sassafras, ferns, lilies, buttercups. And the savannas have emerged and have dominated planet dynamics since then. And that's going to be your grasses, oaks, asters, legumes, all paleologically in the fossil record, very, very advanced. And so when we think about the more primitive and the more advanced condition, we have to think about ecosystem services. And I got a Model A on one side and I got a Tesla on the other side. And the Model A provides no climate control except for the window. I guess you can roll it down. There's no music in it. There's no power assist steering, whereas the Tesla has climate control, music, power assist steering, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So not only does the structural components evolve, but also the services that they render also evolve in time. So something to think about as we talk about ecosystem services. Again, on the left-hand side is kind of the plants that are associated with forests, very, very primitive plants. And on the right-hand side are the plants that are associated with grasslands and savannas. If we take a look at kind of the autumn ecosystem phenomenology chart again, we can line up the forest in the green, the savanna and the salmon in this case, and edibility. We can see forest is relative to savanna lower. Savanna is very edible. Savanna supports complex web-like food webs, whereas forests are more simple and linear. Nutrient conservation in a savanna is super high. That means CO2, that means nitrogen, that means the essential 6 elements that life is so dependent upon. Nectar resources, forests, much lower, savanna grasslands, much higher. Fruit resources, big things to eat like nuts and apples and things like that. Savanna grasslands are producing fruits. Forests are just really not very fruitful, let's put it that way, okay? So we can just see the edibility from the more primitive condition of the mosses and liverworts over time into the savanna grassland systems increases. Nutrient regulation, meaning carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, nitrogen in our soils, phosphorus in our lakes and streams. Again, nutrient regulation really increases when we go from the mosses to the flower systems. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, the exact opposite. So again, by regulating those nutrients to the ultimate life facilitating biosphere, the earth, we can see that, you know, we have regulated our nutrients to create the perfect environment, the perfect water, the perfect soils, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the whole Gaia concept, who was brought to us by Sir James Lovelock. And it's not a theory anymore, it's a concept that we use, very powerful concept. There she is, Gaia, the Greek goddess, Mother Earth. And in a way, we can look at this and we can say, well, savanna actually represents the ultimate essence of Gaia. And James Lovelock was saying the worst thing that ever happened to his Gaia concept, where the New Age hippies got a hold of it and started worshiping it, because it's a very strong scientific view of ecosystem phenomenology, thermodynamics, etc. So what is forest? I actually came out of my undergraduate work and I was totally a forest person. And I made a living for the first couple of years, cash money, identifying forest and rare plants. So I walked so many miles of forest. And you know, my research later on, even way back then, it's like, wow, forest is, even just because there's trees here doesn't mean it's a forest. I mean, I got to walk miles and miles, and then boom, I hit this really cool, very diverse chunk of land that was, you could tell as you were coming upon it, it's like, oh my God, I'm getting closer and closer and closer. And it's like, oh, here it is. Wow, where's the grass raptor, you know? So my definition of forest, and I don't know if we have one. I've asked foresters, what's the definition of, is it just trees in the landscape? And I don't think we have an operational definition for it. So I'll provide you this one, and please think about it and see if it works for you. And if not, we should have a discussion about it sometime as a society. But anyways, it's a primitive vegetation associated with landscapes exposed to minimal disturbance for several million years. No glaciers, on different terrains that are really difficult for large herbivores, too steep, northeast facing, nothing really there edible for me anyways. Why would I go there? I can't walk on it. There's nothing in there to eat, so I'm not coming back to this place. Herbivores and fire can't frequent these little areas, and they're dominated by woody and herbaceous plants that evolutionary have origins older than 65 million years. Beautiful things, rare things, unique landscapes. And by all means, they should be preserved where we find them. So that's my definition of what a forest is. Oh, beautiful. Isn't that? These are some of the species, again, kind of a close-up that we have in our area. Maples are very primitive. You can just see it in the leaf, you know? I mean, it's like tulip trees, magnolias. We don't have that. Rhododendrons, we don't have any of those. But again, you go to the Appalachians that haven't been disturbed in millions and millions and millions of years. That's where you see so much of the forest components embedded into the savanna matrix. We'll get to that in a second. Here's more in our area: wild ginger, trout lily, trillium, hepatica, maidenhair fern, all very primitive forest plants. Hepatica is one of my favorite flowers. I think a lot of you out there would say the same thing. Beautiful. And the animals associated with it: reptiles, amphibians, more amphibians, very primitive, birds, dinosaurs. Possum, probably one of the most primitive mammals on the planet Earth. It's a marsupial. There's no teeth formula, they're just sticking out. And oh, the browsing animal, the deer, beautiful little creatures those are. And even seed dispersal, there's no mammals that disperse seed in those days. it's basically the plants are all by ants. He lays them. And I think this is some of the first fruit on earth. It caught on quickly. Um, but you know, what's really interesting is these forest plants, some papers I've read, this mechanism of seed dispersal, an ant can carry seeds 35 miles in 16,000 years. So when I'm 100 miles north of where the glaciers did not go to and the forests were able to maintain, how did those plants get up here? Somebody told me once it was probably tornadoes that blew it up. I think humans brought it up. Ginger, ginseng, hepatica. Sounds like medicinal plants to me. So anyways, it's just kind of an interesting thing to think of. I think from my field experience and walking around, I think that really true forests are actually literally embedded in the grassland savanna matrix that came to dominate the whole planet. So I'm just putting some northeast facing aspects, places I've been to, and it's like, oh my God, are these beautiful forests. So anyways, it's just something to think about, okay? All right, so just in summary, forest is more primitive. Some trees evolved with forest, maple, ash, magnolia, tulip tree. Some trees evolved with grasslands, oak, aspen, willow, hawthorn. Savanna co-evolved with large endothermic grazing herbivores, most of them mammal, and they became co-dependent on one another, obligate to each other. Grassland trees, therefore, are actually sunlight and grace obligate. So just question it below. Is a forest composed of these grassland trees even possible? Just a question. Okay. So what is savanna? Savanna is a grassland with trees that evolved with grasslands and grazing animals. And these trees, again, by the fossil record, are like oaks and hickory, willow, aspen, some of the rose species like hawthorn and plum. Okay. So grassland trees, not all trees belong in forests. Some of them definitely prefer the open savanna. It's a highly evolved, advanced biotic assemblage of plants, animals, fungi, and microbes in the soils. It's the most functional, productive, diverse, provisional terrestrial ecosystem ever. One way to look at it, okay? And yet we continually to draw these maps all the time, and we need slack, we need flexibility in our planning. A prime concept of complexity and adaptive management is having slack in these systems. This comes from the database, you know, showing me, I've got a project area here in the pink down there. And according to this, brown is in prairies and the green is kind of the oak openings. And according to this, I should plant prairie here. But as I pull the camera further up in space, the difference between prairie and savanna is really more of scale. From this section of space, it looks like my project area is sitting in a savanna. There's grasslands, there's oak openings, oak barrens all around it. What I'm getting at is native grasslands. Prairie is our colloquial word here in the Midwest, and actually more of American now. But prairie and savanna are the same thing. These lines sometimes confuse us in thinking about more clear of what we're actually really talking about. If it has a tree in it or not, it's more of a principle of scale in time or space. If you stand in that spot long enough, a tree will probably appear or disappear. You know, if you're facing one way and it's all grassland, is that a prairie? And you turn around, there's oaks behind you. Now you're looking at, you see what I'm saying? It's just a blended situation that we need to do. Here's the number 10 in the middle there. That is my section that this project is in. And if you look around it, these are the surveyor's notes. I actually went to the surveyor notebook and looked it up. And these are the prime for each section: oak, prairie, timber, savanna, prairie. So where am I standing? It looks to me prairie, oak, timber, oak, prairie, prairie. Looks to me I'm standing in the savanna. And that's what I'm saying. It's a fractal situation. What are we standing in? Is it prairie or savanna, or are they the same thing? The Marshner map, I'm just writing some kind of a small paper, just quick like. The Marshner map is the default original vegetation for Minnesota, even though, look at the name at the bottom of the Marshner map. And this was renamed in the 1980s. The natural vegetation of Minnesota at the time of the public land survey, not the original landscape vegetation. And I'm going to say that in 1848 to 1909, it was capturing a transitional vegetation. Herbivores have been removed from Minnesota in its functional role 150 years before this map the data was collected for this map. and 50 years after fire was still an actual feasible functional trait on this landscape. So to me, the Marshner map represents a really cool map, a window into what the vegetation looked like in 1848 in the case of my section here, but it's not the original vegetation in Minnesota. It's not even close. And what do we mean by original anyways? Where are the elephants? And even the Marshner map has evolved. Here's the 1930 or 1974 version of it. And we can see how the original version was aspen openings or oak openings. And we changed that into oak woodland and oak brushland. Even down here, it's like pine groves or jack pine barrens have been changed into, boreal hardwood coniferous forest and jack pine forest. So it's just, so it's evolving. The actual map is evolving. So anyways. So let's just talk about oak forests and woodlands right now. We have a lot of money in Minnesota to do work for restorations. And every time I come into a site that we're looking for to restore a viable community, I don't think that the woodland and the oak forest is viable. I think it's a transitional state. And I just read somebody the other day from Washington, Oregon in the 1880s or 1980s said the same thing, Phillips, and we'll get to that. And I've been calling it a transitional state. Phillips is calling it the same thing. This site here is determined to be an oak forest. And I think we get that from, we see all the trees, so we automatically think forest, right? And then we see an oak tree in it, and we think, oh my gosh, it's an oak forest. Put the arrows in there just so the people that have not been able to see what we're looking at here, that's an open grown oak. When this oak grew 300 years ago, 250, there were no other trees around this oak. So it had this oak, and that's the preferred form, the 501 preferred form of these grassland trees, this very open canopy to catch your solar energy like crazy. And you can just see the arrows are pointing at the branches of this open crown. Most of them are not dying and dead. But we see the trees and we think forest, and we see an oak and we think oak forest. We really need to learn how to see the savanna and the trees type situation. Here's another one up at Little Falls, Minnesota. These are the arrows here are pointing at some of the original trees with their open grown canopy again. All the other trees have grown in since that time. Here's another one in Minnesota River Valley in Bloomington, Minnesota. Those are all red oaks actually grown in this case with buckthorn understory. In Europe, they call that a pole trunk forest, and they realize it's a second wave of successional growth. These trees are screaming straight up to get into the sunlight, and red oak are more shade tolerant type of situation. But this occurred basically 300 years before 150 years before the original public land survey occurred. And we lost fire at about the same time. Why would you burn if there's no herbivores to attract to the burn? So once the herbivores were gone, Native Americans quit burning again. Minnesota River Valley, again, this is called an oak forest. There's actually 3 oaks in this picture. The rest of them are maples. This process is called mapleization. We're moving back to a more primitive state. Look at the ground layer. It's very, and these are the symptoms associated with an afforested condition. There's no oak regeneration going on in here. There hasn't been any oak regeneration in the Minnesota River Valley that I'm familiar with in 70 years. And when our remaining oaks die, they will not be replaced. So will it be an oak forest anymore at that point? The soils in a lot of cases are completely bare, 80%, 90% bare, so they're eroding. So this ecological capital that we built up in the savanna grasses and wildflowers that were covering and pumping carbon in the soil are now just washing away, and we blame the worms. And if there is a ground layer present, it's dominated by nitrogen-loving plants and trees. Why is there so much nitrogen there? Because we broke the nutrient cycles when we got rid of the animals. So there's no, and fire. So the nutrients are just piling up and piling up and piling. It'd be like throwing a bunch of dead bodies in your backyard. Pretty soon it's just like, you wouldn't want to go near that nutrient that's back there. So these are called nitrophilic shade tolerant species in this case. Okay, most of our invasive plants can be considered nitrophiles, loving excess nitrogen. So the question here, are invasive species really invasive? Or might it be more accurate to think of these species as symptomatic of the loss of biomass harvest by herbivores and fire that broke our nutrient cycles and caused excess nitrogen to accumulate, which facilitated what we call invasive species. Here's Minnesota River Valley again. There's two oaks here. They're leaning out over the trail. You can see the open canopies are stretching towards the south, trying to get any sunlight. These trees, the one furthest on the right has lost several huge branches onto the trail just recently. I'm sure that tree is gone. We are about one generation away from no more oaks in the Minnesota River Valley. That whole landscape there was short grass prairie savanna at one time. Oh man. Okay. So just final question on the oak woodland thing. If there's no oak regeneration occurring in an oak forest or oak woodland, can we still call it an oak forest or an oak woodland? So these are questions that you will have to deal with. Some quick pictures of other places. Phillips, an anomalous transitional vegetation came about due to lack of grazing, humans using fire, dysfunctional state. So here we see it going from the open savanna, included late stages, bare soils, all the way down. Here's the model when we have grazing. Notice the carbon fate in this situation, the buffalo on the left. The carbon is coming from the atmosphere into the soil storage by roots sloughing off after the grazing occurs. Notice the spring ephemeral lawn in the shade where the herbivores actually graze it down really short in the hot summer, allowing those spring plants just to come right up. So that's called the grazing lawn. Notice nitrogen is going from the soils up into the atmosphere being oxidized in this scenario. But let's get rid of the herbivore and see what happens. Remember, it's a tool in the toolbox. Now nitrogen is collecting, it's not being upscaled through food webs, and carbon is now coming out of the ground as everything falls to the surface and just rots and goes back up. Pretty soon, look what's happened to our soils. I mean, there's no more deep rooted plants in there. We've grown up in all these nitrophilic trees, fast growing. The oaks took over and died. There's a few species left, and pretty soon invasive species will come in and take over. And now the point is, now there's nothing out of it. We cannot graze this anymore. It's catastrophic. Okay. So again, we've gone from the most evolved terrestrial ecosystem on the planet into a highly dysfunctional state by removal of the keystone component, and that's the grazing animals in this case. It's the exact same concept of clear water state becoming a turbid water state. Okay. And so this is that catastrophic regime shift line. We go from the top left-hand corner over there. That's the very functional system. And we remove the herbivores, and then the pyrocentric cultures move away. And all of a sudden, these weedy trees grow up that are fire intolerant, a rapid increase in litter on the ground. And then there's a lot more nitrogen, which facilitates a really fast-growing, non-flammable vegetation, rapid decrease in sunlight vegetation, complete loss of ground layer vegetation, an increase in soil erosion, an increase in heat index, and then finally non-native species move in, and it's over with. And in a lot of these situations, this is all we do in restoration. Oh, it's an oak woodland, so we remove the invasive species thinking it's fixed. This is the power of state transition models when we do this. We have to move it way back to the beginning. Okay, C.S. Holland, great, said, the difference between the functional and the dysfunctional state are two things: loss of keystone processes, socialness. He said that a long time ago, and I just read that last year. I'm like, oh my God, the oak woodland, the oak forest, the loss of grazing and fire in this, it fits perfectly. So C.S. Holland, amazing guy. So where can we find geography? Let's take a quick spin around the world. Oh, let's just start right here. And I just started a quick list, and I didn't finish it, but I want to finish this of all the townships, incorporated, non-incorporated Minnesota. You can get that online. And how many groves, how many dales, how many, et cetera, can we come up with named after Savanna? But let's go. Let's start right here in Minnesota, Bellwin, and there's, Sand Plain. Oh, we're in California now, the blue oak. Look at those trees out there. Oh my gosh, I think that's Spain, the Dehisha. Aspen Parkland back in Minnesota, or could it be Manitoba, or Pine Burns, central Wisconsin type situation. Ponderosa Pine Savanna, beautiful area out there. Oregon, the blue oaks out in that area. Yosemite back in 1890s before it became afforested. Okay, Arizona, grasslands, trees. It looks like a savanna to me, by the way. Texas, I haven't been in the hill country of Texas, but I hear it's phenomenally beautiful. Georgia, look at the people where those arrows are. That's a longleaf pine forest. Oh, the Appalachian balds up there. New Jersey pine barrens. Taiga. I mean, literally grasses, sedges, and trees. Oh, that's a savanna right there. Around the world we go, into Russia, into Sweden, the oak woodland. I don't know how they say that. Montado in Portugal, the Cerrado in Brazil. There's China, grazing horses. Look at all the yellow and all the orange in South America is savanna or grasslands of some sort. Mongolia, I'd love to go there sometime. Tropical savanna, South Africa. You see what I'm saying? Savanna really becomes the dominant terrestrial planet. Oh, old lines in the United States of America. It's the transition between grasslands and forest. However, if we really look at all these plants, pines and oaks and all these things occurred, and we look at those afforested conditions, we could really draw those lines to look more like that. Okay, so it becomes more the dominant terrestrial ecosystem in North America. And if we think of forests as being embedded into that matrix, this is where we're going to find the forest. So it's just kind of a different way of looking and thinking about this. Now, here's a really cool concept. Here's the line. I used that line yesterday to show fire. East of the 100th meridian, it was all driven by humans. West of the 100th meridian, it was probably inspired by lightning. So in this case, that line too would say everything would have been trees and forests on the east side of this line, but it wasn't. And that's what's so powerful. And that's what brings us to one of the most powerful concepts in all of ecosystem ecology. And that's far from equilibrium dynamics. Grazing animals, fire, other forces prevented that thing becoming forces, held it in disequilibrium. And anything in disequilibrium works super hard. That's the mitochondria. Every living thing on the planet Earth and probably in the universe has mitochondria. That's what keeps us alive and maintaining a positive discharge on one side, negative discharge on the other side, of which life comes from, adenosine triphosphate. That's the essence of life. And if you scale that up to the ecosystem, that's what we're looking at. It should have been trees, but it wasn't. It wasn't in equilibrium. When you go into equilibrium, you die. When my battery goes into equilibrium, I call it a dead battery, and my car won't start. So it's interesting to look at it. Can we look at the world as becoming, that was the trend for evolution? Okay. Interesting thing about 1491, there's Christopher Columbus, by God. Savanna is actually a North American word. The Taino indigenous cultures for their tree grass landscapes down there in the Spanish borrowed it. There's Fort Snelling, southeastman in the 1830s. Fort Snelling, look at the lack of trees in this situation. Sitting over about in probably Egan, looking north towards Minneapolis, down on Pike Island someplace. There's Lake of the Isles. There's Madison, Wisconsin, 1840s. There's Madison, Wisconsin today. There's a big old tree. This section has been called Southern Mesic Triforest. And we could not do anything to save that tree, and that tree's dying because we put a label on it. And that was that. So anyways, keystone species of this thing. And from yesterday's talk by Sarah and Heather, again, the powerhouse concept, maximum power, biotic vortex. A lot of these keystone species we're thinking about have massive amounts of energy that flow through them. And I call it a biotic vortex. So that's one. Here's another. So again, you can scale a keystone species of anything you want. That's oak is in Missouri. I've never seen it, but if you pull up big bur oak on the internet, that tree comes up all the time. So many people have taken a picture of that tree. So of course, in our region, one of the keystone species are the white oaks. And by the white oaks, maybe there's 200 different species of white oak. Lepidoblanus basically is what I'm talking about. And that's a bur oak right here. They're highly edible. They're graze obligate. They pass so much solar energy up and nutrients up through food webs. They regulate nutrients that way. Everything in our ecosystem ate white oak acorns, either directly or indirectly. Laden with endosperm, super highly edible. That's Oklahoma bur oak. You can see where the Native Americans really got into that. Here's a really interesting thing. More primitive flowers have really large sexual parts, like big petals and big sepals and big stamens and big pistils. And more advanced flowers have really, really, really small little stigmas or sexual parts. That is the female flower in a bur oak. It's beautiful. I mean, so anyways, kind of that's bur oak. The ultimate solar panel, possibly. How old are these trees? It's hard to say for sure. There's one a 72-inch diameter. It's a big tree. Because we really don't know how old these trees are, because they could have been browsed for 100 years or centuries before they were allowed to become a tree. So again, we can measure the rings. Oh, this tree is 250 or 350 years old, but how old was it maintained in that grub state before it was allowed to become a tree? Any tree above 32 inches is considered a huge tree. And so you should go around your neighborhood and find all your big bur oaks and then do a blog and, big bur oaks of Brooklyn Park, wherever you're from, type situation. Red oaks, a little more primitive, shorter lifespan, more shade tolerant, lower structural quality. All these are more primitive traits, not nearly as powerful as the white oak tribe. Okay, but there's other trees in the fig hills. Fig hills is the order of the big mass trees. And the hickory trees east of us, aspen. I can't tell you in my younger days in restoration ecology how we were told to kill every single aspen because they're invasive. Of course they are when you don't have elk, deer, beaver, eating these things. Of course they're going to be invasive. That's the largest organism in the world, right there, pando. Highly edible, highly graze edible. I mean, beaver's favorite food, rabbit's favorite food. That's an elk 9 on the lower right-hand corner down there. Hawthorn trees, in the rose family, again, super, super powerful tree, feeding nectar, feeding pollen, feeding browse, feeding fruit, and, providing some place for shrikes to eat too. Plum, another rose family species right there. So again, nectar, pollen, fruit, browse, super powerful, tons of nutrients and tons of solar energy up through food webs. That's what you want to restore if you want to restore a functional ecosystem, are those food webs to channel that energy and to channel those nutrients outward like that. And from that, you will get your ecosystem production of ecosystem services. That's as simple as it can be. Here's a plant I want to add more of to our native crabapple. Hazel also very common once historically at this time with the big nuts. In my region, I live in Bloomington right now. All these trees are really common, listed by the original public land survey notes in Minnesota River Valley, aspen, hazel, oak, aspen. There are no more hazel, there are no more aspen, and our oak will be gone in a decade or two. And literally it's being held in place by social mess and the loss of keystone processes, okay? And the vegetation of the savanna, it's a movable feast, all that was edible. Okay, animals, of course, we don't have to go through this. But even one things that were common in some of our lifetime, things like groundhogs. Oh my God, they're gone. Fox squirrels. I see a fox squirrel now like once every 3 years. I'm like, oh my God, it's a fox squirrel. It used to be so everywhere. A lot of these afforested oak woodland things that we're looking at right now, there is not enough high quality food to feed mice. And my back lawn feeds more mice and rabbits and squirrels than down in those that we manage for nature. Something to think about. Okay, that's very common. These are the species that scare me, the ones that were really common at one time. Now they're just gone, going. Even the dung beetle can be considered a keystone species. So again, natural history, look at those species, learn every part you possibly can. Natural history, we need to be teaching more and more and more of it, and then start to put those parts together and how energy flows connected them and et cetera. It's just, that's where ecology becomes fascinating. All right, let's restore one. Let's take some savanna and some lessons I've learned over doing restoration in savanna. I think, and I've said this before at this conference, restoration is a three-legged stool. We got to remove the bad, we got to release the good. And the thing that we fail at is number 3, we fail to restore the long-term keystone processes that reinforce our desirable assemblage for hundreds and hundreds of years. So first, we've actually got this machine running right now down in Austin, Minnesota. I'm doing some tree clearing. Can it be open? You got to go 70%, if not 80%, if you're going to go back into savanna consideration. If you go 50%, within 2 or 3 years, it's going to close right back together due to exponential growth up in that canopy. You have to go beyond a threshold. You can't just go to the threshold and then let it collapse. You got to go way back. And that's hysteresis concepts. And that's the state transition models will allow you to understand that. Hey, here's another way to do it. And I've actually worked with landowners that we've been employed horses to actually do the culling of the trees. So that's so beautiful to work with horses. Here's a species integrity index that I developed based on ODM concepts. And this helps us determine which trees we can score them on the very far right-hand column. And we can score them, and this helps us. These are all native trees, well, the bottom one is, and it allows us to score these trees, and we can predict which ones are, not predict, but prescribe which ones to harvest and which ones to not. So this is different from our current floristic quality index, which is kind of biased to rare species. This is more biased to keystone species and how it promotes ecosystem integrity. So possibly a new way of thinking about things. Here's something that we failed to do. all that biomass laying on the ground is just dripping nitrogen back into the soil, which invariably keep flushing out these nitrophilic species, native, non-native species that we cannot deal with, non-flammable, non-edible. They're not helping us, out competing our native stuff that we're seeing. So you have to pick up as much of that stuff and burn it up, oxidize it. I don't like shredding and leaving that stuff all over the forest. It's like putting mulch in a rain garden. You're going to get a lot of weeds out of that. So we try to even pick up as many possible sticks as we possibly can. My crew just like, oh my God, we're picking up sticks again. But the end results are phenomenal. Please use grazing whenever you can, and we'll talk about that in just a second. Here we're actually doing seeding. We've got the place cleared out, but there's so many different ways to seed. We have to go beyond just our simple one-time, shot like that, all the eggs in one basket. But try multiple seed rains. Try dense swath seeding of aggregate species. Bring in the plant materials like some people will be talking about later on, I think today or tomorrow, from Dakota County, about bringing in plant materials from stuff that's really difficult by seed to create nurseries that you can transplant. Okay. And then you have to restore the third leg of that, is restoring the processes that maintain those assemblages in desirable configuration. So we don't have to spray and spray and spray again and again and again and again. And if we're burning without burning for the reason why we're burning, to create better grazing habitat, then that's kind of like a hyper reality of some sort. I don't want to be involved in realities. I want to be involved in reality of situation. But biomass harvest is critical. It's just critical for nutrient cycles. It's just critical for the function in these ecosystems, something that we're not paying attention to. Please use native species whenever it's possible. But if it's not, you can substitute domestic stock. Don't be afraid of it, because in the end, it's really grazing we need to restore, grazing ecology, and the type of grazer means a lot less than grazed or not grazed in the long run. So please go. And here, silvopasture, this is coming on strong in Minnesota. Some friends, Sustainable Farm Association, look into their website, University of Minnesota, silvopasture right there. I just took a picture, screenshot this morning. There's Tyler Carlson up there, talk to that guy. These are real farmers doing Savanna. They want our help. They want help. And how can we do better Savanna restoration and still profit from this in our land? How can we market this? Think of where this stops. We marketing, helping these guys do good Savanna restoration, native species. They're getting paid for high quality products that are using restoration. Where does that stop? Okay. And if you can't even use domestic, then still biomass harvest is important. Haynes, some of the most diverse grasslands in the whole world, are in old traditional European grasslands. The bottom picture is a place that we work in Washington County doing it. So anyways, Haynes can really do a lot of that. And I'm just right about at the end, but again, I've already talked about this. Savanna restoration can also be used to restore human communities. We can create so many jobs in restoration. We can create so many jobs in animal care and animal husbandry and animal processing and creation of these artisanal foods, local, regional, resilient food sheds. Think of the people. We need people back on the land again. We don't need these nature areas just to void. We need people working the land like the Native Americans have for centuries and thousands of years, okay? So we can restore these human communities by restoring Savanna. That's why, why wouldn't we do that? So at the very end, that's why not only is Savanna important as just kind of a natural sense, but it's important to humanity as a whole for restoring the most sustainable, most productive, highest quality terrestrial ecosystem ever on real-time solar energy. So with that, I hope you've kind of like, some interesting stuff to think about. That's all I wanted to do, was inspire you to think about it. And maybe if you see a big giant oak on the street today, or in the schoolyard, in the park down by your street, go up to that tree and give it a hug and ask it how many buffalo actually slept in the shade underneath you. So again, I appreciate very much for your time today, and have a wonderful time at this event today. Thank you a lot.